The following program is a production of Naleo TV.
Thank you all for coming this evening. This is a subject matter I think that affects all of us, and really appreciate you taking your evening time to come. We have an excellent program tonight. We have representatives from the federal, state, and county experts to provide you some very informative information on climate change. Okay, could I have our presenters please come forward and take your seats up here? Thank you. We're going to do something different than we don't normally do in our forum format tonight. I'm going to be doing some opening remarks and a short presentation to give you a little background on global warming, aka climate change. And then I'm going to turn over the program to our moderator tonight, John DeFries. And then John is going to introduce the individual speakers. And we'll run through our normal presentation cycle in the first hour. And in the second hour, you have an opportunity to ask you questions, and we certainly welcome you to do so. You should have 3x5 cards, which you can fill out and hand to one of our representatives that will pick them up. But before I begin, let me, because my fellow board members will give me heck if I don't do this, we are a community enterprise. We are a nonprofit. We are all volunteer. So with that, I'm going to begin this evening by talking a little bit about climate change from the macro perspective for the next 10 minutes. And when I get done with that, we're going to run a 6-minute film all about Hawaii and climate change impacts, and then I'll turn the show over to John. So if we're ready, here we go. First and foremost, if you've been living in a bunker somewhere in Montana for the last 10 or 20 years, you probably aren't aware much about climate change. But in fact, it's hard to miss the media when we're finding scientific reports coming out, it seems like almost on a daily basis, about temperature rising, CO2 loading into the atmosphere and into the oceans, and just basically the impacts that are associated with climate change. Of the last 17 years, 16 of them set a record. That is, each year was hotter than any year before on record. And this is a global phenomenon with local consequences. There's a group that started about, I guess it was around maybe 5-10 years ago, Bill McGibbon. It's a group called 350.org. And they were basically a climate education group, and they picked the number and name based on 350 parts per million as the sort of make or break point in terms of CO2 loading into the atmosphere. Well, this year broke another record. We had from Mauna Loa recording over 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, CO2 is a natural reoccurring phenomenon, but what's happened since the industrial age is human activities have loaded additional CO2 into the atmosphere and put things a little bit out of balance, or a lot out of balance. There's only two slides and you're going to see a lot of the graphs tonight, that really matter, and it's these two slides. The one on the left is as you can see, and I don't know if this is going to show, but this slide is the CO2 concentrations that have been loading up into the atmosphere since the industrial age. So since my birth in 1950, you can see the increase in CO2 loading, and the trend is undeniable. This graph shows what we're seeing in terms of temperature rise corresponding to the CO2 level rise. Now, the thing about CO2 loading in the atmosphere from human causes, and we'll get into the detail of that in a minute, is the fact that it, in fact, affects just about everything you can think of. All life on Earth, water, energy, land, the decisions we make, where we put our money, how we invest, and what the future holds for the sustainability of the planet. There are 4 suspect primary gases that we humans emit. And the first one is carbon dioxide, or CO2, which represents about 75% of the gases that we've added to the atmosphere since the industrial age. The next is methane. Methane comes from a variety of sources. It comes from basically fossil fuel extraction, of fracking on the mainland, which we don't have that problem here, but does add a lot of methane to the atmosphere. Agriculture is a big problem with methane emissions. And landfills, which we do have here on island, are also sources of methane. But one of the more interesting aspects of methane contribution to the atmosphere in the last 100 years has been what we call a feedback loop, where we are actually, as we load carbon to the atmosphere, we raise the temperature of the planet, we start to melt the frozen tundra and ice caps. And these are locked with millions of tons of methane. And so as they melt, they release more methane into the atmosphere. The hotter it gets, as a result of the methane and the CO2, the more they melt, and so on. And that's that feedback loop. Other minor gases, nitrogen oxide, and fluorinated gases are industrial and agricultural outputs. But if you notice basically that methane has 30 times the potency as a greenhouse gas that CO2 does. So even though it is less than 75%, it's only about 14 to 15%, it in fact is 30 times more potent. Good news is it doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long as CO2. We know that from man-made or human-made contributions to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, energy, our residential commercial industries, and transportation are the main suspects. These graphs are mainland data, doesn't really apply directly to Hawaii. By example, we don't really have natural gas in abundance here, but petroleum or fossil fuel and coal are primary contributors to the energy mix here in Hawaii, and also diesel power plants here on the Big Island that are contributors to CO2 and other greenhouse emissions. Interestingly, solar, which at one time we were told would never be practical, would never be cost effective, is like the same people that told us that basically putting seat belts in cars would be too cost prohibitive and put the car manufacturers out of business. Some of you are old enough to remember that. And the interesting part about the exponential rise in solar is its efficiency increases and the cost per kilowatt hour continues to reduce itself. So we're right now, solar is more cost competitive than coal and cost competitive with oil, and quite honestly, if we did the true cost analysis, more cost competitive than any fossil fuel that we have available to us today. Now there's an interesting pushback. The tobacco industry convinced for 30 years the American public and lawmakers that tobacco was good for you. They had doctors that said that you could smoke and it'd never harm you. And finally came around to the conclusion, the science caught up with the rhetoric, and we know today that tobacco will kill you if you have enough of it. There's a $5 trillion fossil fuel industry out there annually that is working to convince lawmakers and the public that fossil fuels are good and they are harmless in terms of the energy mix. We know that scientifically to be false, and we know the consequences of continuing on the current path of being fossil fuel weighted in our energy mix. So what are the consequences in Hawaii and worldwide? Sea level rise is number one. It's an island state. That's got to be a major concern to us. Superstorms, these are storms that are fueled by natural recurring storms and hurricanes that are fueled by CO2 emissions into superstorms, and the flooding shorelines and erratic trade wind changes, declining rainfall, impacts on overall temperatures in agriculture, and this is important, the warming and acidification of the oceans. Bruce Anderson from DLNR is going to give us an excellent presentation on that. Okay, so these superstorms, this is the mainland, okay, and they once had a great view of the ocean. Now they have the ocean in their living room. Our neighbors to the east in the Pacific and low-lying islands are now on threat of having not only their islands wiped out, but their entire cultures as a result of climate change. Last year, actually this year, we had a repeat of last year where we had two dual hurricanes who had Big Island in its crosshairs. Fortunately, we didn't suffer as we could have potentially suffered. This is a satellite map of 2015, which was admittedly an anomaly year, but directly correlated to the load of CO2 in the atmosphere and the warming of the planet. Those are all hurricanes, all those sort of green and orange looking swirls, and in the middle is Hawaii. We know for a fact that Hawaii is continuing to be impacted increasingly by these superstorms and the rise of sea levels. This is a projection from University of Hawaii, the 20 to 50 year spread of impacts of water inundation into the low-lying areas in the Honolulu area. And the reason, of course, that there's a spread between 25 and 50 years is because the science is imprecise, but the science is absolutely dead certain that climate change is not a Chinese hoax. Okay, the other thing that we need to consider is the fact that here on the Big Island, we're going to be seeing the phenomenon of wet areas getting wetter and dry areas getting drier. Of course, this is the deepening of divisions of the climate zones in these areas that are going to have deep impacts on our agricultural industry. The correlation between weather and climate's long-term, weather's immediate, but they are connected. We know that higher temperatures tend to impact evaporation of the moisture, which in turn has a feedback loop in creating more intense rainstorms. And that has, of course, an extended impact into our reef system. One of the new parts of the science, and as the science continues to evolve and continues to get scarier, quite honestly, the more we know, is the changes in the jet stream. And the changes in the jet stream connected to the rise in temperatures, which are connected to the CO2 levels. The jet stream, of course, as you know, dries weather, and beyond driving weather, has a major impact on our trade winds, which we rely on to keep us cool. El Nino was and continues to be a natural phenomenon being supercharged by CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, we have a couple of environmentalists here in the audience, including my friend Steve Holmes from Sierra Club. And if you don't really believe in the environmental community, believe in DOD. Department of Defense believes that climate change is the #1 security risk today. Not Syria, not Russia, not China, but climate change. The impacts, of course, that they see is that climate change can increase the likelihood of international civil conflict, state failure, mass migration, and basically instability on the planet. These are social economic impacts that are driven by environmental changes. They're real, and quite honestly, the Department of Defense is very concerned about it. Now, the good news. We've got through all the scary stuff. Let's get to the good news. We have 200 countries that have, nearly 200 countries that have gotten together, and since Kyoto in 1997, which was our first recognition of climate change as an issue to be addressed on a global level, have gotten together and signed off on the Paris Accord. The Paris Climate Accord is significant. Unfortunately, it's not binding in the context of there are no real penalties, but there are commitments by 200 countries, the major polluters, which, by the way, historically have been considered as a part of the solution, not players. China, India, Russia have all signed on to the Paris Accord. This is significant because it means that these countries, although they may not have, if you will, economic consequences for not meeting their CO2 reduction goals, they have public consequences. Anybody recognize this power plant? It's right there across the airport. That's courtesy of Helco, which is still, like many utilities, living in the past. Fossil fuel is important to them, and we have 3 excellent forums on energy, 2 from 2015 and 1 from this year, from September, all on our website, westhawaiiforum.org. And I encourage you, if you're interested to understand where energy policy is going, where Helco stands in energy policy change in the mix, go to our website and watch the forums, which you can do online. We have a solution here, and it's really, in my opinion, 3 parts. One is clean energy. energy being one of our major contributors to the global warming mix of emissions. And we have a robust clean energy economy if we follow through with our 2045 commitment to be a 100% renewable energy state. Infrastructure. We have to begin to think differently about infrastructure. Our airport's at sea level. Ali Drive's at sea level. You know, you can go on down the list. Hilo's at sea level. When we put our assets, our tax dollars into these infrastructures that are right at sea level, knowing that sea level is going to rise, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. We really need to think differently. And we know that you're going to hear from some of the speakers today about some of the changes that are being considered in terms of policy and how we apply our resources going forward on infrastructure. Economic stability and sustainability is something that's important regardless of climate. But climate is a major factor. If we're going to create a robust and sustainable agricultural community here on the Big Island and elsewhere in the state, we need to be prepared for the changes that are coming in climate, with its different types of crops, locations of where they are, and so on. So I say we have really three major assets to making this work in Hawaii. One is our people. We have a very unique culture in Hawaii. We have a history of the Hawaiian people of living in balance with nature. And those of us that have come over here since then very much embrace those values. We can do it here. With or without the federal government, we can do it. Our location is both an asset and a liability. A liability because we have to import everything right now. But it's an asset because we basically have the ability to be the showcase for the world of a sustainable economy and a renewable, clean energy economy here in Hawaii, in our environment, of course. So with that, I want to thank you for this opening. I'm going to jump into a video, which does a much better job of telling the story for here in Hawaii, and then I'm going to turn over to John, the program.
Over 1,000 years ago, centuries before Columbus and Viking longships ventured across the Atlantic, Polynesian voyaging canoes pushed out into the uncharted waters in the Pacific and found Hawaii, the planet's most isolated landmass. Hawaii forced the original explorers to quickly learn how to live in balance with natural resources and our environment, and provided enough food to feed an entire population without the large-scale imports of today. Now, our entire planet is entering even more dangerous, uncharted waters. Climate change, an explosion of technology, and a finite amount of natural resources force us to summon the same courage as those who headed out into the unknown. Now, Hawaii is having to learn to chart a new path.
95% of what we consume, we import. 90% of the energy that we need to maintain our lifestyle is imported. We start to question the ability for us to have enough fresh water.
Hawaii has a number of challenges and opportunities in the face of those challenges. I think the most immediate is the fact that we have a climate crisis that's moving very rapidly.
The challenges here are great. They're really important. They're, in some ways, decades ahead of what other people are experiencing elsewhere. So this is the front line.
Beginning with the Hawaiian Renaissance in the 1970s, coupled with renewed environmental awareness and an energy revolution at the turn of the 21st century, Hawaii has emerged at the leading edge of the sustainability movement.
There is an amazing movement that's redefining Hawaii, and we're essentially just going back to learn how to be islanders again.
Hawaii's isolated islands and small electric grids have long been subject to a crippling dependence on imported oil. But now, the nation's highest rate of solar panel installation, a high penetration of electric vehicles, and new battery storage options are forcing Hawaii to rethink and redesign the traditional energy utility model. Hawaii's tropical forests and reefs teem with hundreds of unique species found nowhere else on Earth. But Hawaii is now known as the extinction capital of the world.
We've let too many slip away, but it's forced our islands to pioneer work in community-based marine management, conservation partnerships between public and private landowners, and incredible efforts to rehabilitate species. We are playing catch-up fast.
The Aloha Plus Challenge lays out strong, statewide 2030 sustainability goals endorsed by county mayors, the governor, and other key leaders. Hawaii is the only state in the country to have clear sustainability targets embraced by the state legislature and every single county.
We cannot address the issues that we face in Hawaii in our silos. You have to address food security with energy security at the same time. You have to address water security. All of these are integrated issues.
Hawaii has a strong and thriving indigenous culture that has influenced and mixed with later migrations of American, European, and Asian populations.
We recognize that all these different worldviews make us stronger. And if you're going to tackle these big problems, it helps to have many hands and many perspectives.
Hawaii's image as paradise belies the serious challenges that it continues to face. Invasive species, soil loss, and climate change impacts are significant issues that deserve investment and sustainable solutions.
I think the greatest opportunity for Hawaii is actually at the water, energy, food nexus. What's often seen as a barrier, which is Hawaii's geographic isolation and size, I would say is actually an asset, because you can really look at those ridge to reef solutions or Mauka to Makai solutions, and it really builds on Hawaii's culture of sustainability and systems thinking.
We have some of the most wide-ranging ecosystems, from high alpine summits to coral reefs. And things like climate change, global warming, can be studied here in a way that you can't find access to those systems almost anywhere else.
The advantages of developing a global model on an island is that you have a finite area to work with. From that, you can scale it up.
Time is our most limited resource, and our greatest asset is people. And Hawaii stands out because the people part of the equation is really working well.
Hawaii is moving towards the balance, and when Hawaii achieves it, it becomes that starlight for the rest of the world to see and know that it can be done. That's the gift.
This is why philanthropists, scientists, elected leaders, educators, business leaders, and change makers are finding ways in Hawaii to merge the past and present, science and spirit, and protect our Earth as a fragile island floating in space.
Thank you. Aloha mai kako. My name is John DeFries, and as of April 1, I became the director of the Department of Research and Development at the request of the mayor. In that role, I am an endangered species that will vanish December 5. But I'm grateful to be here, and grateful for all of you who took the time to visit what many feel is an abstract topic, but many more of us feel is a growing urgency each day. I want to welcome Bruce and Scott and Abby, who I'll introduce formally in short order. Let me say that what we have in common is we all love this island. It's an island that was given a very special name by the early discoverers who came here. Undoubtedly somebody of a very high rank with a very special gift of naming. Did not have to convene a committee to meet on it for months in and months out. Recognized that this island had many natural gifts, and that these gifts and resources that were life-giving would be best described as being the place of Ha, the breath of life, the place of Vai, the fresh water and moistures of life, and E was a reference to the spirit of life. And so you and I are the inhabitants, the descendants, the newcomers, all striving to become Aina, or children of this land. It's an important perspective to keep, because when we start to see the environment as an extension of our own family, we start to see it in a very different light. And it's important that we remember that. We descend from a native culture that had more than 400 names for rain, more than 300 names for clouds. That would suggest that this was a very intimate relationship that our ancestors had with the climate and with the weather. And so for us to be convening in 2016 on this particular topic is not only timely, but is part of a living legacy that goes back centuries. And with that in mind, we're extremely fortunate to have today's panel. Let me introduce our first speaker. She is Dr. Abby Fraser, a researcher for the Pacific Islands Climate Science Center, leading a new effort to understand the future of drought impacts in Hawaii and the U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands. Her past research has focused on describing rainfall trends and variability in Hawaii and how vegetation responds to climate variability. She has been involved in numerous research projects spanning a broad range of topics in climatology and ecology, with an emphasis on better understanding the impacts of climate change in Hawaii. At this time, please welcome Dr. Abby Fraser.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. It's great. It's great to see such a big crowd for such an important topic. So I'm here to talk to you today about climate in Hawaii, climate change in Hawaii, and some of the impacts that we are seeing here based on the current state of research in the state. So I want to start out first by saying that Hawaii is home to an incredibly diverse and complex climate over a very small area. And I feel extremely fortunate to be able to study climate here. And part of the reason for this extreme climate diversity in Hawaii is due to our varied topography. So this complex topography with our winds leads to extremely complex climate patterns. As you all know, we have an elevation range from sea level up to almost 14,000 feet, which affects temperature gradients, and then rainfall is affected by the windward and leeward effects of islands, as you all know. So if we look at patterns of rainfall, for example, so this map here is showing average annual rainfall patterns for the state of Hawaii. And we have our trade winds coming in from the northeast, interacting with that complex topography and producing generally wet windward areas, dry leeward slopes, and there's another phenomena that produces very dry high elevation areas in the state as well. So when we updated this 30-year average product in 2011, we actually found that the summit of Mauna Kea was the driest spot in the state, receiving on average about 8 inches per year. Very, very dry. And the wettest spot we found in the state, on average, is actually an area in East Maui called Big Bog. And it gets about the same amount of rainfall as Waialeale, but just a little bit more. So this area gets, on average, 400 inches of rain a year. Some years it's as high as 500. So this range we have in rainfall in Hawaii is greater than what you find on some continents. And it's all right here in our small state. So if anyone is interested in learning more about our current climate patterns, we have a website called the Rainfall Atlas of Hawaii. It's rainfall.geography.hawaii.edu. And on the site, we have interactive maps. If you haven't explored the site before, you can click anywhere in the state and get your rainfall information. You can download files, so images and GIS layers and Google Earth files, and you can get all kinds of methods and information about rainfall in Hawaii. And if you're interested in more than just rainfall, we actually launched another website in 2014 where we mapped over 40 other climate variables in the state. And this website also has interactive maps and downloads. So I encourage you to check this out. It's a great way to really interact with the climate here and see how complex these climate patterns are. So Bill mentioned in his first talk here a little bit about how natural variability is also a big factor when you're talking about climate change. So Hawaii, like everywhere on the planet, is highly affected by large-scale modes of natural variability. So I'm talking about El Nino Southern Oscillation, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Those are two of the big ones for Hawaii. And these are recurring climate cycles that happen in the Pacific Ocean, and they affect weather patterns globally. So in Hawaii, we're pretty familiar with El Nino and La Nina, and these are news articles from the past year. When we have an El Nino event, the summer before the El Nino really hits, we have increased tropical cyclones in the Central Pacific near Hawaii. And that was that image, the 2015 summer with all of those cyclones all around Hawaii. That was partially due to this El Nino event. And then as we head into the winter with El Nino, Hawaii tends to get very dry and very hot conditions. So, and La Nina tends to have the opposite effect. So with that kind of baseline about climate in Hawaii, we can look at how the climate has been changing over time. And we've seen upward trends in temperature. So temperatures across the state have been increasing, and we're seeing this in our data, especially at the high elevations, and nighttime temperatures have been showing really strong increases. In terms of stream flow and base flow trends, we're seeing declines in stream flow across the state. And this has been noted in multiple studies. And it's likely related to a decrease in groundwater storage and recharge, and is indicative of decreasing water availability in the state. So this is definitely something that, you know, we're interested in keeping track of. In terms of rainfall, we are also seeing drying trends across the state. This is a paper that came out this year. So it's a study that looked at 500 years of rainfall near the Hawaiian Islands. And over the last 160 years, we've seen a strong decreasing trend in rainfall. Now, some of the work that I personally have done with rainfall trends in Hawaii is I've looked more at the spatial details of how rainfall is changing across the state. So what you have here are maps of rainfall trends from 1920 to 2012. And all the reds, oranges, and yellows are drying trends, and all the blues are increasing trends. And the top, we have annual. The mid panel is showing you wet season trends, and then the bottom panel are dry season summer trends. And anything with this black area around it, that black hatching, is a statistically significant trend. So that is a pretty robust trend. And the first thing we notice is that you see drying trends across all islands, but the patterns are quite complex. You know, a few areas do pop out. East Maui has significant decreasing rainfall in all seasons, and the biggest one is this West Hawaii region of the state has experienced the most severe declines in rainfall of any other area in Hawaii. And these declines have been consistent over this time period. So it's pretty much just been declining steadily since 1920. So what are the models projecting for future climate in Hawaii? What we have researchers at the university who take the global model data and relate it down to a regional scale so we can figure out how we think climate will change in the future in Hawaii. And right now the models are showing robust increases in temperature, so those current trends we're seeing will continue. They're finding increases with, it's projected we'll have increases in tropical cyclones near Hawaii in the future. And for rainfall, it's very similar to what Bill had said. We're expecting dry leeward areas and some variation in the windward areas, but there's more uncertainty. These are two different research groups at the University of Hawaii that have looked at future rainfall using different methods, and we're coming up with pretty different answers. So there's some variation, but there are definitely some common areas. So leeward areas are projected to get drier. Windward areas probably slightly wetter, but with variation. So we've seen how the climate has been changing and what the projections are for the future, but I wanted to also go over some of the impacts that we're seeing on the ground here in Hawaii. And one of the areas that we're really expecting a lot of changes is with regards to native forest birds in the state. So rising temperatures mean that mosquitoes can live at higher elevations. And currently, most native birds live in those high elevation forests because it's above the mosquito line. And mosquitoes carry avian pox and avian malaria, and a single bite can transfer malaria parasites to a susceptible bird, and the mortality rates are greater than 90% for some species. So this is why these endemic native forest birds are living at the high elevations. And you see in this Kauai image on the right, this is Alakai Swamp area. The current area, the yellow, is showing where the birds can live now pretty safely, free from mosquitoes. And then if you add 2 degrees in future warming, their habitat area shrinks considerably, 85% reduction in their habitat area. So climate change is expected to accelerate malaria transmission in our native forest birds, result in huge range losses. So this is projected range change for the Hawaii akepa, and all of that red is habitat area that is lost for this bird species under future climate change. And in general, we think this is going to cause a dramatic decline in native bird populations in Hawaii. And this may sound depressing, and it is, but these projections are showing that we do have some time for managers to start taking actions to help protect these species, that these effects we're seeing are going to start happening 2050, 2070, 2100. Another area that we have already been seeing impacts in the state of Hawaii are with endemic silver swords in Haleakala. We have found declining populations of these silver swords in the crater, and they've been able to link this to the increased dry and warm conditions in the crater. So this is one example of population declines in a very important species for Hawaii. Wildfire is another major threat to natural resources and native species in Hawaii, especially here on the dry side of the island. Across the state, we've seen an increasing trend in annual area burned. People are the primary driver of wildfires in Hawaii. So this graph is really interesting. It's showing the number of ignitions in the state. And I don't know if you can see, but the point all the way at the top right is Oahu, because most of the ignitions are happening where the people live. But the greatest area burned is actually in non-native grassland and shrublands. So areas like Puvawa and this western side of Hawaii Island. And what's really interesting is when we compare our percent area burned to mainland areas, Hawaii actually has a greater percent area burned than the contiguous US and the western states. So fire is a big deal for us here. And the global models are telling us that drought events are likely to become more intense and more frequent. But there's variation by region. And in Hawaii, farmers, cattle ranchers, and folks on water catchment systems are the most immediately affected by drought. And most severe droughts are associated with El Nino events, and there are huge economic losses associated with drought in the state. So I just started a position at the USDA Forest Service in Hilo, and my project for the next 2 years is synthesizing drought information in Hawaii and trying to look at how these future changes in climate are going to impact drought regimes for Hawaii. So stay tuned for more information on how drought's going to impact Hawaii. But to sum up, we have an extremely diverse climate. We're seeing temperatures rising across the state. Rainfall is decreasing, especially in the Kona region and West Hawaii Island. In the future, we can expect more of the same, temperatures increasing, rainfall decreasing, especially in leeward areas. Windward areas are a little more uncertain. And climate change is not just an issue to worry about in the future. It's already happening now here on the ground. So it's not something to put off and deal with later. We need to be dealing with it now. So that'll say thanks, and happy to answer questions later.
Super. We're going to, I would have done so much better in science if you were my teacher. tough news being delivered with so much enthusiasm, but thank you. It's great to have you here. You know, our next presenter, because there will be time for questions and answers after we get through all of the presentations, but Dr. Bruce Anderson is no stranger to any of us. He's had high-profile positions at the Department of Health, and today is the Director of Aquatic Resources at the Department of Land and Natural Resources. Bruce was born and raised in Hawaii, attended Punahou Colorado College, received his master's in public health from Yale, and his PhD in biomedical sciences from the University of Hawaii. Please welcome Dr. Bruce Anderson.
John, I'm going to go down front.
Okay.
All right.
Sure.
I can't see the slides from where I was. Can you hear me? Is this on? Evening. It's hard to be optimistic when you look at this picture, but I'm going to talk about the impacts on our aquatic resources a bit. And Bill, I think, laid out a very nice presentation on what's happening globally. Figure out how to advance this thing. They're off. He asked me to come up with some slides to show the relationship between carbon dioxide levels and sea level, seawater temperature increases. And most of you can see the slide, but you can see the arrow pointing to where we are. If you look at the timeline, this is the cumulative CO2 emissions, actually, that go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And on the left, oh, that's better. On the left side of the graph there is the temperature increase in sea level, seawater temperatures that are associated with that increase in CO2 emissions. You can see that the increases aren't dramatic, or at least they don't seem dramatic when you look at 4 degrees. But a couple of degrees makes a huge, huge difference in how organisms respond. Here's another graph that shows the temperatures that we're measuring today. This actually goes back to, again, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and shows you what's happening up to date. Again, what's important here is the increase and the steady trends toward higher temperatures. This slide is a slide showing that the temperature increases in our sea surface temperature increases are not the same everywhere, but everywhere the water temperatures are increasing. You see, I don't have a pointer, but Hawaii's of course off to the left there, and although it's probably not increasing as much as some other places, it is nevertheless increasing.
Bruce, can you?
Finally, this is a graph showing historically what the water temperatures have done over time. You can see the vertical line there is where we are. And it projects what would happen if we cut way back on CO2 emissions, which is the blue line. You can see it levels off and does not increase. And if we do not do anything, if there are no controls, you can see what happens with the red line. It continues to increase. So that's sort of a picture of what's happening with the ocean temperatures. And of course, they correlate with changes in atmospheric temperatures and so forth. This is a slide, I think it was taken of corals in Kealakekua Bay. Back in 2014 and 2015, we had the worst coral bleaching events in history. Some of you probably have been out there diving and seen what happened. In 2015, almost 90% of the corals here bleached. When corals bleach, what happens is the zooxanthellae, the symbiotic organisms that live with the corals, are expelled. And they nourish the corals. And if they don't recolonize the corals simply starve to death. When the water temperature goes down, sometimes the corals can recover. It takes a couple of months, often, for the zooxanthellae to return and to, again, function well with the corals. But if it lasts more than a couple of months, usually the corals die. Now in 2015, I mentioned bleaching affected about 90% of the corals. Well, about 50% of the corals here in West Hawaii died. they're dead, and you can see those now as you go out there. These are the common cauliflower corals that look like a cauliflower, but there are, of course, dozens of species of coral, and some are more affected than others. Cauliflower coral seems to be the one that's most affected. Some of these corals may recover distinctively. If you go out diving and you look and you see the corals that are bleached, you see algae starting to grow on the top of the coral. That coral's dead and algae's growing on it. Often if you just see a bleached white coral, it has a chance of recovery. But that gives you some sense of where that particular coral head is. Well, the question that I was going to be talking about tonight, and we'll talk about a bit, is what management strategies are considered most effective in promoting coral reef recovery following bleaching events? We really can't do a whole lot about world temperature changes. Let's face it, it's on a trajectory that will probably continue as it is, at least for another decade or two, even if we do start dramatically reducing emissions. So we're looking at more than changing this trend when we think about the health of reefs. We're looking at how do we help the reefs be more resilient to this change, given that we can't do a whole lot about what's happening immediately, and then how do we help reefs recover? Many people just sit there and they sort of wring their hands saying we can't do anything about it, but we in fact can do something about it. And our task over the last 6 months has been to try to figure out what can we do here in Hawaii, here in West Hawaii, to help our reefs be more resilient and help them recover. Well, we took a approach that I haven't seen elsewhere, but I think it makes sense. We first of all surveyed experts from all over the world. Coral bleaching is occurring in the Great Barrier Reef and many other areas, and wanted to learn from people elsewhere what were they doing, what was effective and what wasn't effective. We also did a major literature review, looked at literally hundreds of papers on the subject, what's working where. And then very recently we had a decision makers workshop, and I'll go through these very quickly. When we surveyed the experts all over the world, we asked them about strategies that have been reported to be effective in some places. Establishing marine protected areas, basically closing all areas to fishing, was one option. Putting in rules to reduce the take of herbivores. Parrotfish, for example, are very effective and very important in the health of reefs. They're effective in that they eat lots of algae. They're big fish. They live on algae, so they keep the algae under control so it doesn't grow back over a reef after it's been bleached. And they also have a very unique feature. If you've all seen parrotfish eat, they eat the algae and they poop out the coral. And what they're doing is they're ingesting the coral and digesting the algae in the coral. And as they're doing so, they're called excavators and scrapers. They actually leave a denuded surface on the coral. They eat dead coral, by the way. They don't eat live coral. They're looking for the algae in dead coral. Hawaiian parrotfish do not eat live coral. They do in other places. But they basically dig a hole as they're eating, which leaves a denuded surface where new coral polyps can settle. There's no algae on it. So not only do they eat a lot of algae, but they leave a fresh surface where new coral polyps can settle and repopulate the reef. So they are probably the most important fish on our reefs today. In any event, developing rules to limit the taking of these important herbivores is one option. Limiting activities that may impact the corals. Kanama Bay, many have been there probably. You can see there are hundreds of people in the water tromping around on the corals. That's obviously breaking up corals and is damaging. Aquaculture has been thought of. We have a coral nursery on Oahu where we actually grow corals. I'm not terribly optimistic we're going to grow a lot of coral. It grows only about a centimeter a year. So, a coral head the size of this cup is probably 10 years old. You can imagine that it's going to take a long time to grow enough coral to actually be able to plant. Hawaiian corals, again, grow very slowly compared to many corals in other parts of the world. Their land-based strategies. If you talk to any scientist, you're going to hear that their sedimentation is a huge issue. Not so much in West Hawaii here as it is on Oahu and other places where you have lots of development and urban runoff associated with polluted runoff. There are eradication techniques. You can't see the slide there. Remember the crown of thorns invasion? Some of the older folks who died a lot probably saw them. I did when I was out here. But they are a species of starfish that aggressively eats coral. And there are other strategies. I won't go through all of them. So anyway, we pulled the experts. Actually, 174 people around the world who we sent this survey to and asked them about what strategies are effective and what weren't effective in their particular area, whether it's the Great Barrier Reef, Caribbean, and Hawaii. We had quite a few respondents from Hawaii. This is where they came from. You can see about 42 of the respondents, most of them were UH or NOAA scientists, but we had good response from the Great Barrier Reef and other parts of the US. Some of the people that responded were managers, most of them were scientists, and there were a bunch of others who responded. All of them had a history of publishing papers and expertise in this area. Well, here were the 5 most ecologically effective management strategies. I have to move up a little to see what these are, but the first one, the blue line there is the ones that are most effective as determined by this group, was reducing sediment stress on corals. Now, on Oahu, again, this is a huge issue. Honolulu Bay, for example, you have lots of stormwater runoff going into the ocean there. Sedimentation's a huge issue. You do have concerns here. There are many streams that flash and create sedimentation problems for the coral reefs. Reducing nutrient chemical stress on corals is also a major issue, along with the sediment often is fertilizers and other pollutants that can impact on corals. Establishing a network of permanent protected no-take areas was thought to be very effective worldwide. Basically, these are areas where fishing is banned, places like now Kapolegu and other places. So these are some of the issues that were thought to be very effective. Here's the list of issues that were not. Remember, there are about 10 of them in between the very effective and not so effective areas. Creating artificial reefs, new substrate basically for corals, is not thought to be effective. And interestingly, at the very bottom of the list was establishing a moratorium on aquarium fish collection. They've done this elsewhere, and most scientists don't feel that's important. The reason for that is most of the aquarium fish are very small. They don't eat much algae. They're pretty. We all love seeing them in the water. But from a reef health standpoint, they don't make a whole lot of difference. Many of them are important, of course, but focusing on them is probably not going to be a very effective strategy. That's not to say we shouldn't limit the take, and we do here, but that's an example of the strategies that were thought to be effective. I'm not going to go through this decision tree, but we also, as we looked at the literature, looked to see how they made decisions on where they were going to impose new regulations. In some cases, you would expect natural recovery, and it probably won't help to do anything other than just wait and watch and see what happens. In other situations, if you look at the very bottom line there, you can do a number of things that would help to protect the reefs and allow the corals to repopulate the reefs. Protecting the herbivores on the reef was one of those, and reducing the anthropogenic factors that affect coral growth. I won't go through the whole list, but that was thought to be, all those measures were thought to be helpful in different situations. Now, again, many people have sort of just watched the coral reefs degrade. Others have tried things that seem to work pretty well in some areas. The creation of no anchor zones. You know, we have mooring buoys for many other vessels here, prevent the anchors from dragging on the coral reefs. And that's thought to be a very, very effective measure in terms of protecting the reefs, keeping them healthy. They have tried transplantation of coral fragments. Again, we have a coral nursery and we're going to try that. In the Philippines, the corals grow a lot faster and it's probably more effective there, but we're going to be experimenting with different types of corals to see if we can get them to grow and what was most resilient. In some places, they basically stop people from diving, and that's happened in Southeast Asia, where there's just so much pressure that the reefs have suffered. And they have imposed moratoriums on aquarium fish collection in the Great Barrier Reef. Again, most people don't think that is being terribly effective. So about 2 months ago, this is all pretty new stuff. We had a workshop of scientists here, and we took the list of effective measures that they've used elsewhere, and the decision was, well, the question to them was, okay, what would work here in Hawaii, given we're different than lots of other places, that would be helpful to assuring the resiliency and restoration of our reefs. Up on the top of the list was this development of a fully protected no-take MPAs. Again, that was also thought to be effective elsewhere. Candidly, that's very difficult to do politically, with fishing pressures and so forth. But eventually, we're going to be looking at how can we best string together our marine protected areas and management areas to maximize their effectiveness while allowing for reasonable fishing. Reducing sediment stress is also thought to be a very high-ranking measure. Again, trying to do what we can to reduce polluted runoff and nutrients. And enforcement is also important. By the way, you have a new vessel now here, and we got a new, you may have seen in the paper, we got a new boat for the dock care folks to enforce our current rules. Now we get into the areas which are relatively easy to do, and that is to put in new rules to limit the take of herbivorous fish, and we're in the process of looking at that. That's something we can do essentially with a stroke of a pen. We don't have to find millions of dollars to build treatment plans or to divert stormwater or whatever we might do. So you can be assured we are going to be proposing some rules that would be intended to try to protect herbivores and other important fish on the reefs. So we're in the process now of doing that. I'll give you a sampling of the sort of things we're thinking about doing. I'm not going to say we're going to do this, but these are the types of management measures we're considering. Banning scuba spearfishing. By the way, you do that here now. I think it's a great move, at least in the replenishment areas here where they're protecting aquarium fish. There is no scuba spearfishing allowed. We don't have any bag limits on uhu. What makes me just sick when I go diving, I come shore sometimes and I see these guys with several cooler fulls of parrotfish. You know they're not eating them all, they're selling them somewhere. Many countries have banned the taking of parrotfish and other important fish. We haven't. There's no limit on the number of parrotfish someone can take. We're one of the few places in the world that allow monofilament lay gill nets. These are nets that fish get trapped in. Even if you take the fish out of the net, the fish's gill is so damaged they'll die. So anything that hits that net is dead, even if they release it. But that's a very, very damaging fishing practice. And finally, collecting urchins. I was at Mahukona not too long ago, and there was a guy there with 2 tubs, laundry tubs, full of sea urchins that he'd taken in probably the course of an hour. The 3-pronged spear just went out and hooked them all. And they're not good from what I understand, and they were actually eaten here. But, some parts of the U.S. Northwest area, sea urchins are very popular food items. I hope this doesn't go the way that the sea cucumbers did when they became very popular, and we had to put an emergency order to keep people from taking them. But urchins are also important in eating algae. That's what they do, they graze the reefs. So we're going to probably see some combination of these rules come to public hearings, and we may have them here. But thank you, Bill, for allowing me to talk a little about this.
Thank you, Bruce.
Bruce, thank you. Bruce and I, watching Bruce talk about people poking sea urchins, and it reminds me that he and I have a bunch of friends in common, and it's just incredible to watch what you can envision would be where little boys in Hawaii growing up, kind of going out and knowing all of these things, and now having schooled themselves to become leaders in this field, and bring a lifetime of knowledge in addition to science to your role. So thanks, Bruce. Our next presenter sits in a very important position as he advises the governor of our state on the subject of environmental control, quality control. He got his MA in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Hawaii and his bachelor's in Archaeology and Philosophy from the University of Hawaii. Scott Glenn is the director of the State of Hawaii Office of Environmental Quality Control. That office administers and advises all of the state agencies. In his professional and volunteer roles, he has led teams working closely with various stakeholders to identify environmental issues, monitor emerging concerns and opportunities, and implement the tools to address them. At this time, please welcome Scott Glenn.
Aloha, everyone. One of the questions that were raised with Bill was, what are policymakers doing to look at climate change? What's the long-term strategic planning that's happening in the states? So that's what I'm going to speak about. 2 months ago, Hawaii hosted the Olympics of the Environmental World, the World Conservation Congress, part of the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And the reason that Hawaii hosted it, and this is the first time it's ever been held in the U.S., was because of Hawaii's aloha spirit, its cultural heritage, and its commitment to environmental protection and environmental awareness. Hawaii hosted more than 10,000 people from 192 countries that came here to talk about island Earth. And they adopted the metaphor that Hawaii uses, that Nainoa Thompson helped come up with, to talk about how they're going to act for the next 4 years on their roadmap, as the IUCN called Navigating Island Earth, coming up with commitments to look at integrating indigenous knowledge into sustainability practices around the world. This is something that Hawaii has now given to the globe, this aloha approach to integrating indigenous cultural attitudes into our environmental protection. And at the event, the governor described a vision that he has for his administration to better protect and manage our natural resources. Before I get to that, though, I'd like to talk a little bit, too, about some of our other political leadership. So Senator Schatz is our senior U.S. Senator, and at the IUCN, he had the keynote speech, and he talked about how around the U.S. and in other countries, we're starting to see insurance and reinsurance companies and infrastructure investors asking, what are you doing about climate change, before they give you money? And that if you don't have a climate change adaptation plan in place, your rates are going to be higher for your insurance and your reinsurance. So they're already looking at this at the global level for investing billions of dollars into infrastructure in different countries. 2 years ago, he also hosted an event on Oahu where he invited former Vice President Al Gore to come and speak about climate change and how Hawaii has this growing presence in our national conversation about what's happening and what to do about it. Other folks, our other Senator, Mazie Hirono, is on record for supporting climate change, acknowledging that it's real and calling for action. So has Representative Tulsi Gabbard. She's also spoken about this numerous times. And so has Representative Colleen Hanabusa. So all of our congressional leadership are on the record saying we care about climate change, we acknowledge it, and we need to do something about it. And I'm very thankful we're going to have them in Congress given how our election turned out. Here in Hawaii, we also have, at the local and state level, a lot of commitment to looking at climate change. Our mayors have all said that they are aware of climate change and things need to be done to address it. Our state senators, the representative for this district, Representative Nicole Lowen, has been a leader for climate change in the state legislature. So I think we're starting to see this acknowledgement among our political leadership and policymakers that climate change it's not, is it happening, but the question is, what do we do about it? And so when we think about the long-term strategic planning that needs to go in place for what we do about it, responding to climate change has two sides, right? There's the mitigation side and there's the adaptation side. Mitigation is how do we take carbon out of the air or reduce putting carbon into the air so that we're not raising the temperatures anymore, or as much as we've committed to doing so far. And adaptation is figuring out how do we live in a world with a changing climate? What are we going to do as our temperatures get higher, as we get more hurricanes? In 2007, the state legislature passed an Act 234, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So we've already been working on, for 10 years almost, the mitigation side, and that's evolved into the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative and the effort to get us 100% renewable electricity, and we're expanding that conversation already to start looking at what can we do about transportation fuels. So we're fully moving forward on the mitigation side. But what about adaptation? In 2012, there's a Keystone Act by the legislature called Act 286, and it created the Climate Change Adaptation Priority Guidelines, which are these 10 items listed up here. Now, for those of you who don't know about the Hawaii State Planning Act, and I understand perfectly if you don't, but it is the foundational document for the state of Hawaii in all of its planning activities and capital improvement budgets. And every plan, general plan, community plan, land use plan, development plan, has to relate back to the State Planning Act, and it has to address all of the guidelines that are listed in the State Planning Act. So when your county, Hawaii County, currently is undergoing its general plan update, correct? So it has to look at these climate change priority guidelines and address them. And if it doesn't, it's up to you as the citizens of the Hawaii County to hold them responsible and say, you haven't done what you are required to do under the State Planning Act. This is a foundational piece of legislation that shapes the entire state and all of the counties and how they have to think about climate change and everything that they're doing. But what does this really mean, right? It's easy to say, hey, here's priority guidelines, now think about them. So 2 years ago, the state legislature created what's called the Interagency Climate and the ICAC, the Interagency Climate Adaptation Committee. And so their task is to actually figure out how to make this stuff work, to bring it down to nuts and bolts level. So what they are doing is they're a committee composed, co-led by Department of Land and Natural Resources and by the State Office of Planning. And their first task is to look at sea level rise. And what they're trying to do is figure out what is the threat of sea level rise and where is it going to impact and what to do about it and what tools do we have to respond to it and what tools do we need to respond to it. They have a report due to the legislature in 2017. Once they have that report in, they'll be moving on to another topic. So it's not just stopping at sea level rise. Next up will probably be something related to water, possibly rainfall, possibly near shore waters, surface water, groundwater. So stepping back, we've heard a lot about climate change. We've heard about hurricanes, changing rainfall, loss of our coral. This is all foundational science that we need to think about this. And one way that we help wrap our minds around this idea of climate change is that we break it up and we break it into its little pieces. And we think about what are we doing already that can help us adapt to climate change. So at the IUCN World Conservation Congress, Governor Ige announced his Sustainable Hawaii Initiative. And as part of that initiative, the idea is that all of these actions are things that help us to enhance our resilience to climate change. Protecting our priority watersheds helps to ensure that we have native forests for our native birds to move to. It helps to ensure that we have rainfall that's falling down and we're capturing it into our aquifers so that as our rainfall declines, we're capturing more of it and able to better withstand drought conditions. The nearshore water management is exactly what Bruce was just talking about. That's how we manage the nearshore water. Doubling local food production. So if we're going to have any sense of self-sufficiency as islands, we need to produce our own food and we need to invest in that. Renewable energy electricity, we've already talked about that. That's been an ongoing effort for the state for a long time. And then our biosecurity plan. One of the greatest threats to our self-sufficiency is invasive species. And we're finally getting Department of Health, Department of Agriculture, Department of Land and Natural Resources all together and working on how to help control invasive species. And we have a plan that's been drafted. I believe that Department of Agriculture held some meetings here on, at least on Hawaii Island, getting public feedback from it. So they're working on the draft, trying to move it to a final. These are all important aspects that, while none of them have the words climate change in them, all of them are about climate change adaptation. And so we are able to help start thinking more along those lines. Department of Health also recently hosted a working group with Hawaii Public Health Association, the HPHA, to look at health and climate change. So what about our communities, the people of Hawaii? I mean, we've talked a lot about the biophysical world, but people are vulnerable. Higher temperatures with elderly populations mean additional heat strokes, and minority populations have high health risks already, exacerbated by additional heat strokes and drought conditions. These are all things that our Department of Health is starting to look at. My office is starting to look at how do we integrate climate change into environmental impact statements. The whole point of that process is to look to the future, look at what might happen and how to plan for it to better design projects that we're doing. So what does it mean to say, let's look at climate change? We're trying to figure that out and tease that out. And then, of course, UH has been doing a lot of great research, and not only science research, but also policy research. They're looking at climate refugees. We already have an issue with COFA migrants coming to Hawaii. We are a welcoming place to them because we are so similar to them compared to the mainland. They come to Hawaii, and as their islands come under increasing threat from climate change, we anticipate more people coming to Hawaii. How do we accommodate that? How do we make that a less confrontational situation? How can we plan ahead for these people? So, bringing together this research and policy work, what we're looking at is not climate change, but we're looking at hazards. We're looking at threats. We're looking at things that we already know about, know how to handle. So you can say higher temperatures will result in increased winds and more hurricanes. Well, we already have laws. We have building codes. We have police powers for enforcing actions involving hurricanes and the aftermath of hurricanes. How do we make those work better? And the idea is applying a climate lens. So we look at what we have now, what's existing, and say, if we looked at this from a climate change point of view, does it work? And if it doesn't, why not? And what can we tweak about it to help it, to make it work? And then by doing that, we'll also figure out what do we not have any legislative cover for? No rules, no permits, no approvals. And then figure out what do we need to create that's new to address this new aspect of our world that's being exacerbated by climate change. And I'm sorry, and then one more point, the Honolulu City just passed a charter amendment creating an Office of Climate Change. And the role of that office is to do exactly that. It's to look at what are the other state or county agencies doing and applying this climate lens, saying, we know you guys are busy, you're in the trenches doing your day-to-day work of your agency. Maybe you don't have time to step back and look at the climate change stuff. So this climate office will do that. And then it will also identify the gaps and make recommendations to the mayor and to city council on things that need to be created or fixed. So that's one way that the city and county of Honolulu is looking at this. So, we're still trying to answer the question of what tools do we need. But in the meantime, I can say with a lot of confidence that our policy leaders, our elected leaders and appointed leaders have a consensus that climate change is real, climate change is happening, and we need to figure out what to do about it. And let's start with the tools that we have and then figure out what else do we need. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Scott. Before I proceed with my short presentation, Abby, we have a question. How and where do you get the 500-year rainfall data?
So that was, I was not actually involved in that project, but it was based on reconstructed data. So I wish I'd looked over the paper again before I came. But yeah, it's using proxy records from other records that we have in the Pacific, and I can't say off the top of my head what the records were, but yeah, so it's a reconstruction. So all of the rain gauge data that we have in the state, our earliest records we have are from 1837, which is pretty incredible. And we have a fantastic network of rain gauge stations. So they were using several other sources of proxy data going back in time.
So Bruce, what's the prediction of shore erosion on West Hawaii?
You know, I'm not an expert on erosion, but Scott, do you have any? You remember?
Is your mic on? Yeah.
It is now. I think.
Okay.
And I was just saying I'm not an expert on erosion, and maybe Scott has some views.
I don't know the erosion rate for West Hawaii, but it is being looked at as part of that sea level rise study that's going on with the Interagency Climate Adaptation Committee.
Is there a website that our participants can go to?
There is. The link is included in my presentation.
Okay.
And Chip Fletcher, professor at UH, is doing shoreline setbacks, erosion rates studies, so he has some probably on his website as well. I don't know it offhand.
He's looking at sea level rise and the impacts of sea level rise as much as he is erosion. Both occurring, of course, but the impacts on sea level rise are, of course, dramatic. You know, Waikiki is going to be underwater basically in 50 years if things go as they are. So but he's the best expert on that particular issue.
There are researchers at UH doing sedimentation studies, and there's a PhD student in my department of geography at UH Manoa who's looking at Kauai, I think, on the west side of Hawaii Island. And I know there's a lot of work in West Maui looking at sedimentation and erosion going on with all of that development happening in West Maui, and Lanai as well. And I know there's some cool work looking at imagery of the sedimentation rates going into the ocean that you can see from aerial photos and things like that.
You know, Bruce, the other thing, we have a question about whether these suntan oils, the impacts they're having on coral, or whether this is just a new generation of new products and a marketing campaign. You want to talk about that?
So your city council, county council, excuse me, passed a resolution I just saw a few days ago come across my desk proposing or urging the state to ban sun care products that contain oxybenzone. That's one chemical that's been identified as being particularly harmful to corals. And if I remember correctly, one drop in 6 Olympic-sized swimming pools is thought to be enough to impact corals. Stress the corals, just as warming of the water might, and that's one chemical that's particularly harmful. What I worry a little bit about is that oxybenzone's been studied. There are a couple of reports that came out, actually the IUCN, but there hasn't been a whole lot of work done on lots of the other chemicals in sunscreens. So we're targeting one chemical that happens to have been studied when there probably are many other chemicals associated with sunscreens and sun care products that are also damaging. But no question, it is a concern, something that, particularly in areas where circulation is poor, like Hanauma Bay and other places, some attention is needed to that. We have an education campaign out trying to reduce the use of sunscreens with oxybenzone. There are alternatives. And in fact, we're encouraging the use of those alternatives. Whether the legislature bans it or not this year, I think is going to be a question, but I'm sure the question is going to be put forward by at least one legislator I know. So that'll be a subject of further discussion.
Super. You know, in preparing for this forum, I ran across this quote here, and I was raised in a family that was very inclusive, and so I thought that for the benefit of having a healthy discussion, we would acknowledge that professional wrestling is real and the climate science is real, and move beyond that. Undoubtedly, he's been giving it a lot of thought over the 8 years and prior to him taking office, and his successor is going to have to process this as well. She was a little more direct. This is the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. As all of you know, the business community, financial community, and earlier you heard the national defense community is very concerned about this topic. And I think Einstein put it best when he said that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And what we need to do is move to another level of consciousness on this island and try and reimagine what the future can be. And part of it is rooted in what I had touched on earlier about what it means to be Kama'aina, or a child of the land, connected in a way that you would be to a sibling, to an elder. And that inside that paradigm of being a Kama'aina, there are values that were touched on earlier by Bill in his opening remarks of love of the land, aloha aina, and malama aina, to care and nurture for it, knowing full well that as we extend the aloha and extend malama, that it comes back and nurtures us. And that at some level, the higher consciousness requires us to be aware that we are Kama'aina of an island planet. And so what I'd like to do is spend some time talking about this particular island, the county's initiatives within the last couple of months that I've been here, and then previous to that, steps that have been taken, really to try and understand that this island is really a microcosm of the planet, and therefore has the ability to attract the highest levels of research and development that will benefit this economy, benefit education on the island, and begin to affect change, because those things that are discovered here can be scaled globally. I'll give you an example. In 2007, Sir Richard Branson and Al Gore started the Virgin Earth Challenge. The goal being to come up with technologies that would remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. This is a poor slide, but what it's basically saying is to take proven technologies that are commercially viable and can be scaled globally. They started out with more than 2,000 applications in this contest. It's a $25 million science prize, and they're down to 11 finalists. One of the finalists is carbon engineering. I'd encourage you to go take a look at this. It's carbon capture technology. It's being birthed up in British Columbia in Squamish. And Kona is on the short list to be one of its first commercial scale plants. Basically what this technology is doing is vacuuming the atmosphere as it moves through the system. CO2 is being removed, low carbon, zero carbon is the exhaust. And as it moves through that process, there are two commercial products, pelletized CO2, and by blending the captured CO2 with hydrogen, a synthetic fuel that could fuel every one of your vehicles tonight and could be refined into jet fuel. Why Kona? So the CEO and a board member were here earlier this year, March of this past year. I said, why Kona? They said, well, Kona, we could power this plant 100% through solar energy. So we're not putting any more carbon back into the air. We like the Asia-Pacific connection. And also you've got some big contract purchasers of fuel, namely government and the military. Putting those pieces in place will enable them to then take to the retail market fuel for you and me. This island is already beginning to attract and has a history of attracting giants of innovation. Earl Bakken, every 20 seconds, a pacemaker is being installed, implanted in somebody on the planet, improving their quality of life. The other gentleman here is Gordon Moore. Both of these gentlemen live about 8 miles from each other, one at Kiholo and one at Manalani. You and I enjoy on our mobile phones today all of the computing technology, all of the data processing that used to take a room twice the size of this with mainframes, in large part because of Gordon Moore. Last year was the 50th anniversary of Moore's Law. The computer chip, half the size, twice the capacity. half the size, twice the capacity. It's going to take innovators of this caliber to move us through the challenges that are ahead. It's also going to take people who understand indigenous knowledge, like Dr. Puolani Kanahele, and her work with the Kumulipo, or Papaku Makavalu, which is an educational paradigm that basically says knowledge is infinite, knowledge is growing, and therefore belongs to no one person, no one institution, no one generation. The source of her work goes back to the chant of creation for the Hawaiians called the Kumulipo. And some of the milestones you see here, as Bruce was talking about the bleaching of the coral, it's ironic that in the Kumulipo, the first life form is coral. And coral is recognized for its intelligence as a survivor. Hawaiian knowledge from the Kumulipo is organized in 3 specific ancestral houses of knowledge: the house of knowledge of the heavens and the cosmos, the house of the planet, and the house of all living systems and life forms. What you and I tend to see as third parties when we look at cultural practices as an art form is itself a very intricate science. You're seeing it manifested on the voyage. 40 years later, Hokulea is now more than halfway around, completing its journey around the world. This is a model used by Google X. Huge problem, breakthrough technology, and radical solution. 4 days before Hokulea left Hilo, the county was asked to host Google X, because Google X is one that believes that this island is an interesting platform for the kind of R&D that they will be doing going forward on a range of subjects. The gentleman you see on the right here is the head of their rapid evaluations team, Richard Duval, who is working with Master Navigator Nainoa Thompson on understanding the next generation of Google glasses. 4 days after that photo was taken, the canoe embarked upon Malama Honua, the worldwide voyage. That voyage started May 2014. In July 2014, the 4 mayors, the governor at the time, and the CEO of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs signed the Aloha Plus Challenge, which you heard about in the film that was showed previously. 6 specific goals that Hawaii has targeted to achieve by the year 2030. One of them being 70% renewable by that year. Already this island is at 49%. It's going to outpace the goals that have been set here. Doubling the local food production is another goal by 2030, a very aggressive goal. But you want to start paying attention to this, the framework for this, the dashboard that's being created, and you're going to start seeing increased amount of information flowing through the community, because fundamentally, it's like one of our friends said, David Fuertes from Kohala. He said, John, my dashboard is every night when I look at my dinner plate, if 70% of the food on that plate is not grown or caught in Kohala or Kona, something's wrong. Something's wrong. July 2014, the Aloha Plus Challenge is signed by Hawaii's leaders. September 2014 in Apia, Samoa, the canoe gets there for a United Nations conference, Island Voices, Global Choices, and it's there that the navigator meets the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. It's being brought together by an organization called the Global Island Partnership, who uses the acronym of the first 2 letters of each, so it's called GLISPA. Remember that, GLISPA, because you're going to keep hearing more about GLISPA. It basically is recognized by the United Nations. It is a corridor into the United Nations designed specifically for islands. GLISPA was founded by the President of Palau, the President of Seychelles, and the Prime Minister of Grenada, and is now building its membership because they recognize that there are 175,000 islands in the world. With a combined population of 600 million, if islands are going to have a voice at the international policy level, we're going to have to unite. I should say, while he was on this canoe, Secretary General told Nainoa, by the time your canoe, by the time Hokulea gets to New York, the United Nations will have done something very big to support your efforts of Malama Honua. This is September 2014. He returns to New York, and in September 2015, a year later, the General Assembly of the United Nations ratifies, adopts the Sustainable Development Goals in 17 specific categories, among them the ocean, and number 13, climate change. We can do all we want on islands. Islands contribute the least amount to climate change and will be the first to be impacted. Our motivations are very different than those on the continent. So this is September 2015. Fast forward, Scott had referenced the Paris climate talks. December 2015, just 3 months later, they're in Paris, and 193 nations signed the Paris Accord. Present at both of these events is this woman, Inger Anderson, Director General of IUCN. You just heard Scott talk about the International Union for Conservation of Nature that had their World Conservation Congress, September 1 through 10 of this past September. So Inger is at the UN in September, in Paris, December of 2015, doing her circuit, and Hawaii County extends an invitation to her to come visit us. And she does. Never been to Hawaii. So in February of 2016, the mayor organizes the Hawaii Island Sustainability Forum. We want to create an environment where Inger delivers a keynote address about what has just happened in New York at the UN, in Paris, and what we can anticipate when she gets here in September for the World Congress. This is organized, attended by about 100 people, and we surround Inger with 3 kama'aina. Nainoa Thompson we talked about. You heard Sam Gahn in the film talk about the extinction of species. Sam is the senior scientist and Hawaiian cultural practitioner for Nature Conservancy of Hawaii. The woman in the top right-hand corner, who I wish was here tonight, but her schedule didn't allow it, is Celeste Connors. Celeste grew up in Kailua, Oahu. It's a local girl. Served in the embassies of Saudi Arabia and Athens. Before returning home, she was the Global Climate Change Advisor in the White House to President Obama and to the National Security Advisor. Somebody touched on earlier how climate change has become a national security issue. That was Celeste's role. Celeste came home to raise her children, good kama'aina girl, and is now the head of the Hawaii Green Growth Initiative, which is the backbone organization of the Aloha Plus Challenge. So what this provided was some insight for Inger as to what she could expect when the World Congress would get here. So she spent 4 days with us. We had her up in a helicopter, Hamakua, Hakalau, Volcano, Pu'uvava Ranch, stopped there and landed the helicopter and had lunch. So she was in sensory overload by the time it was ready for her to deliver her keynote, surrounded by these 3 sources of Hawaii and people that were important to us. At that point, we were 205 days from the World Conservation Congress. So it gave her a lens and a framework to understand what she could anticipate once she got here. And I should also say this was heavily leveraged by a brilliant host committee that was headed by Tim Johns, and you saw the other gentleman earlier on Kauai, Chipper Wickman. So Ingrid's with us in February. Fast forward to June 8, 2016, early this past summer. The canoe finally gets to New York. The Secretary General, as a practice, greets and meets heads of state. He does not greet governors. He does not greet congressmen. He doesn't greet just anybody. It's a very strict discipline. He was there to meet the canoe and keep his promise. The gentleman on the far left is the co-founder of GLISPA. That is Thomas Romengesau. This is June 8. The Hawaii delegation is the host of the Palau mission at the United Nations. 2 weeks after this photo was taken, President Romengesau was in Hilo, planting a coconut tree with us to honor the departure point from whence the canoe departed on Malama Honua. Sealing the ties, this is all about relationships, taking the same island mentality of what it means to be a kama'aina, and now expanding this because we need help and we can help other islands. And we've got to stop going to continents for our solutions on islands. And more islanders are beginning to understand that around the world. This is taken from his speech that day. It's just a very sobering kind of experience to be there. That was just June of this past summer. In July, the Mirkinoi asked, can we join GLISPA as an independent island? We cannot speak for the state. And lo and behold, GLISPA accepted our membership in July. So this island, this county is now part of a global system that is growing on this very subject of climate change and building sustainable communities and resilience, island style. And in September at IUCN, Governor Ige agreed to accept the invitation of President Romengesau to also join GLISPA. I would anticipate and encourage that the rest of the counties will join, and other major landowners are also eligible to do that. So we finally get to the Conservation Congress at 10,000 participants from 190 countries. There's our friend, Dr. Ingrid Anderson, who we had in Kona. She now is overseeing this immense international activity. In addition to all the science, in addition to all the technology, in addition to all the organizations that drive this work, one of the paramount sessions is called Spirituality and Conservation. And Dr. Pua Kanahele is invited by IUCN to represent Hawaiian spirituality. Her fellow panelists are Catholic, Jewish, Buddhist, and Muslim. And it was important to Inger, after learning what she learned here previously, that the spirituality and religious practices of the native peoples be elevated with the rest of the world's religions. Those of you who are in this field, you have heard of the Kyoto Protocol. There are these names for these defining documents that come out of this. This particular Congress produced what is called the Hawaii Commitments. And it lists all of the action steps that are being taken, all of the goals that have been defined for the next 4 years between now and the next Congress. And inside that narrative, I've taken these two excerpts. where a renewed emphasis has to be placed on indigenous knowledge. That knowledge is rooted specifically to places, individual places in the world, and have been marginalized, dismissed, debated, all of that. This now, on this international organization, moves now to the forefront because they realize that indigenous knowledge and native wisdom is essential to achieving the goals. And embodying Aloha Aina globally is part of their mandate. It's about being Kama'aina. Let me close by talking about three Kama'aina. This is Pierre Omidyar and Pam Omidyar. Pierre and Pam are the founders of eBay, doing incredible, provocative, innovative work here in the islands. He's an alum of Punahou. She's an alumnus graduate of Iolani. The gentleman to the right is Kelvin Takeda, president of the Hawaii Community Foundation. In 2011, Pierre and Pam go to Kelvin and say, we've got to elevate the spirit of aloha to a global level. We take for granted what we have here, and we need to now elevate it into an initiative that can give it more global stature and provide a platform for other world leaders to come to Hawaii and share their knowledge and take our knowledge back to where they come from. So in 2014, these three, who came out of an organization called the Elders that was founded by Sir Richard Branson. The gentleman on the far left, everybody knows, is the Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu. And the whole purpose of the Elders that year was to go around to different nations specifically to raise the profile and the priority and the sense of urgency on climate change. That was their whole function. And they were in Honolulu doing that very thing. The woman in the middle is Hina Jalani, a women's activist, a democracy activist, a true leader out of Pakistan, who brought home the emphasis of why leadership by women was so important to this whole move in dealing with issues like climate change and sustainability. The woman on the far right is Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway. In 1987, the Brundtland Commission, she was the chair of the United Nations World Commission on the Environment and Development in what is called the Brundtland Report, or Our Common Future. And so what you had there was people who were steeped in this work, who had years of experience in it, and who are prepared to give even more to get some of these things to turn where they need to. The previous visitor was this icon, right? The Dalai Lama, who came again to speak about aloha and to bring home his message of compassion and kindness and our responsibility, universal responsibility, to stop violating nature. And he has since taken a strong position on climate change and the need for us to understand that this is a common issue globally and that we need to unite as one humanity around it. I'll just close by sharing this statement here. This is a revered Hawaiian elder who in 1962 made this assertion. And the assertion just went like blank for years, decades. And then recently, I'd say within the last 10 years, people keep coming out and saying, reminding us that this is what the elders were talking about, is aloha not only as something that we do between ourselves, but that we express to all life forms, all living systems. And so we now are at this point, and I mentioned I was an endangered species. The next administration under the leadership of Mayor Harry Kim are actually approaching at a very dynamic time for this island. And I wish them so much success in this, because the county is in an excellent position. Not that it's their sole purpose. We have a responsibility as people of this community as well, but to just reimagine what we can become. And I'm reminded, this is the woman who heads the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Impossible is not a fact, it is an attitude. And we need to convince ourselves and internalize what it means to have a new future. Other than that, thank you. And we'll just go down these questions as quickly as possible. Should we have to adjourn due to time, those of you that have questions, feel free to come up and have these addressed. But I'll just put this out. What investment portfolio offers are there for alternative energy locally and globally?
Well, a number of the major investment houses have green funds that are clean energy funds and are sustainability funds that you can look at in your retirement IRAs and also outside of IRAs for investment. I'm not going to push any particular, investment house, but they're all out there, and it doesn't, if whoever you have your investments with today in terms of your retirement or otherwise, talk to your broker.
May I add to that? That University of Hawaii Retirement Fund divested of fossil fuels, and now people are working on trying to get the state pension fund to divest as well.
Excellent.
Scott, this might be you as well. Can you please explain geoengineering and any hazardous effects?
Well, I understand geoengineering to be looking at ways of manipulating our weather and climate to try to offset try to offset changes in our climate. Like many things, if we're messing with a complex system that we don't understand, there's unintended consequences. So the risk of things like putting iron in clouds to try to generate rain would be a geoengineering solution. What might that do to algae in the ocean if that iron comes down and lands in the ocean? There's a lot of unknowns that we prefer to measure twice and cut once, right? So
Hawaii is familiar with that. It reminds me of a mongoose.
Yes.
Yeah. We brought that in to solve the rodents, except one is up at night and one's up during the day, so they never see each other. So now we have a rodent problem and a mongoose problem. But word to the wise as we go forward. What Hawaii government's actions are being done to educate and encourage homeowner associations to actively understand and participate in renewable energy?
There's several things. The Hawaii Real Estate Association has acknowledged that climate change is an issue. The way that it mainly happens is through education with banks and homeowners. There's also financing with tax credits, so people are aware that when they're looking at investing in their home, they're often recommended to look at getting solar because of the financial, not necessarily the environmental or climate change benefits. Now with the tax credits going away and those changing, that's going to change that dynamic, but at least at that point that has been a vector for getting people to understand renewable energy options for their homes. Do you want to add to that?
I know just one actually, because I put a solar system on my house and I live in a homeowners association, and I was surprised to find out that I didn't have to get approvals through the association to install the PV systems. I think there's a state law that excludes them from having to be reviewed. So obviously they're encouraging these solar systems on homes in any association for that measure.
Yeah, and along those lines, for non-fossil fuel vehicles, electric vehicles, homeowner associations can't forbid them. Condo associations have to make provisions for people who own an electric vehicle to be able to put in a charger in their parking spot. The condo doesn't pay for it, but they can't not forbid it. So there are some protections in there.
Here's one. Is Hawaii considering wave storage centers? The first question is, what is a wave storage? No.
We have someone from the NLHA board that might have some answers there. I honestly don't know. I'm on the board of NLHA and I've never heard of it. So,
anybody here informed about wave storage centers? Oh.
There's the possibility of creating a lot of energy from wave movement.
Yeah.
And it's just a storage system that'll store that energy.
So Marine Corps Base Hawaii just put one of those online on Oahu and seems to be working. And I know Governor said he's excited about the technology and would like to see it spread.
Yeah, I think they're also expanding it, that use in New Zealand. I've heard them make references to that. Do you know any other places that are doing this on a scale?
There's places around the North Sea, around England and Denmark and so on. It's actually quite an active energy solution in areas where there's a lot of water movement. And Hawaii would be a perfect place for it.
Super.
I would like to add just that I think there's two pieces to that, and one is waves generation, which is a power generation source. It's zero emissions, and as you point out rightly so, 3/4 of the globe has ocean, and there's some wave activity, there's tidal activity, and all that can be captured. But the storage part of it is a different question. And if I bring that down to where we are here on Big Island and also in the state of Hawaii, we are blessed with a number of variety of options on how we can store energy. And storing intermittent energy, whether it's wind or solar or wave, is really important part of the solution of going to a zero emissions clean energy economy. And we have those options, such as, by example, pump storage. One of the issues that we have here on island, interestingly enough, if you are a DWS, Department of Water Supply customer, you might notice on your bill that about 2/3 of what you're paying for is not water. It's HELCO's electricity to DWS to pump water to your house and buildings and what have you. So HELCO on the other side of that has a problem, and that is the fact that they say we can't take any more renewable energy because it's intermittent and we don't have a way to store it. And so if you have this issue of storage and you have this issue of an ability to apply pump storage, that's water storage, where you pump up during the day when you have excess solar power water into basically a reservoir facility, and then in the evenings you release that water, which drives a turbine to generate electricity on demand. You eliminate the need for these diesel power plants, and you have a zero emission solution. So there, pump storage, because we have a lot of elevation in Hawaii, and we have a water utility which is still kind of stuck in the 20th century, and paying excessive amounts of operating costs to HELCO for electricity could be a part of the solution in partnership with HELCO. So far, there's very little being done on that front.
To add a third piece to that, in the introductory video, you heard someone speak about the water energy food nexus. So we're looking on Oahu at putting in pumped hydro storage for the farmlands in central Oahu to help water irrigate some of the drier lands. So we're looking at that as a way to help put all the solar power and wind power that's being generated on Oahu into something that stores it there, and then it gets released later to get put onto the food that needs it. And if you water your crops in the evenings, right, your water stays longer. So it helps with that as well.
Here's one. On the mainland, conflict between native land concerns, i.e. the Alaska pipeline, etc., and oil and dirty energy sources. Will the same thing happen in Hawaii? And TMT is a point of reference here, but anybody want to comment on that? No.
You want to touch that one?
But, let me just say that what's going to be so important going forward, and I have more experience in this than I ever wanted in my lifetime, but is a regulatory process that is solid. And in the case of TMT, 5 Supreme Court justices determined that the process was flawed. And it's really easy to get caught up on the demonstration and the opposition but at the end of the day, it was a regulatory process that was deemed to be not valid. And that's why we're in a contested case hearing today that maybe should have occurred, if we could look back at it, that is a concern. But, regulatory processes are not easy, but we rely on it. Everybody relies on it, every one of us, including investors, developers, including people who live here. Okay, is the state promoting community sustainable fisheries and/or make the process of establishing those fisheries easier?
Yeah, there's a community-based subsistence fishing program that was authorized by the legislature some 20 years ago, and we just established the first fishery called a community-based subsistence fishing area at Hyanna on Kauai. And there are 4 or 5 other sites where communities are interested in developing their own rules to protect their area, to allow for sustainable fishing and to protect resources in that area that are important to them. Milili'i is one of those. It was actually one of the first communities that expressed interest in doing this. Mo'omomi on Molokai is another, and there are a couple of other sites I won't bother to tell about. But this is a new program that we're just beginning to start up. But one of the things I worry about is I think that's been done largely by default because the state hasn't developed good plans. These communities are taking action among themselves. So my view is we, the state, and with you all as partners, need to figure out what rules will be effective where and move forward together in addressing problems on a much larger scale, and not to diminish or speak against those communities. Kapolei here was one of, it's not called a community-based subsistence fishing area, but that was really the fishing ban, Kapolei, the Kona Village area. It's actually from Kukio to Kalaimamau. That was an area that was considered very pristine and has been heavily impacted by fishermen, and really is no different than a lot of the other areas as you go down to Waikoloa. I could go down the coast there, all the way to Wailea. Really the same pressures, and why not look at rules or regulations to provide for sustainable fishing in those larger areas? And getting back to the point is that it was the community there at Kapolei who really drove the process, and they really wanted to protect their area. But I think it's incumbent upon the state to take a broader look at the issues and come up with rules that apply to all of West Hawaii.
preceding program was a production of Naleo TV.